What is going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, Magnus Carlsen is facing off against the new #2 rated player in the world. That is right, Arjun Erigaisi of India, and this game did take place in the 2024 Speed Chess Championships. And here we go. In the game, Magnus opening 1e4, best by test, then 1e5, then knight to f3, putting pressure on that pawn on e5 of Arjun. And now Arjun, he has a choice. The main line, of course, is knight to c6. However, instead, in the game, he does go knight to f6. This is the Petroff Defense. And here, Magnus Carlsen, what is he going to do about it? In the game, knight takes e5, then d6, knight f3, and knight takes e4. So far, both sides following the absolute main line of this opening. Now here, the main line continues, d4, then bishop d3, short castles, and so on. However, instead, in the game, Magnus throws a big curveball against this opening, as he usually does in the Petroff. He does not like those long forcing lines in the Petroff. Instead here, he simply goes h3. And this is a very quiet waiting move. It's basically a pass. He's saying, you know what, Arjun, whatever you want to do, just play a move. So, Arjun, with that in mind, d5 on the board. He does waste a tempo going d6, then d5. However, h3 is not a very strong move either. So here, Arjun, despite the wasted tempo, he is doing just fine in this game. Now here, Magnus, d3 on the board, driving back the knight, knight to f6, and then Magnus again, d4, him also wasting a tempo, d3, then d4. So now here, believe it or not, we have a position that can be achieved via the exchange variation of the French defense. And here, Magnus Carlsen's move, h3, really isn't that strong of a move. It does stop bishop g4, but overall, it might as well be a waste tempo this early in the opening. So here, Arjun already on move, what is this, 7? Move 7, he's doing perfectly fine. All right, here, Arjun, the main line would be perhaps bishop d6 and castles, rook e8, so on. Instead, knight to c6, going for a very imbalanced position. And now here, Magnus, he jumps at the opportunity to pin that knight on c6 to the king, bishop b5 on the board. Not necessarily a dangerous idea. I mean, you can go bishop takes c6, however, black is perfectly fine after b takes c6, but we will have to see if Magnus does want to go for that in this game. Now here, bishop d6 on the board for Arjun, then castles, and then rook to e1 for Magnus. So far, very standard stuff. Now here, Arjun, bishop f5, a very active square for the bishop. Typically, bishop f5 is not possible, as that bishop will be on d3, but here, with it on b5, bishop f5 is an excellent choice. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, he decides once and for all to imbalance the opening. He does take that knight on c6. Bishop takes c6, giving up the bishop pair and the bishop for the knight on c6, but in return, damaging black's pawn structure permanently. So, bishop takes, then b takes, and now here, of course, those two bs on d6 and f5 are a huge asset. However, Magnus, he does believe he can get counterplay playing against those weak pawns on the, on the soon-to-be open c-file. All right, now here, Magnus, bishop g5 on the board, not the strongest idea. Instead, the main idea would have been knight d2, then maybe knight f1 and knight to g3 or knight to e3 in the spirit of the Roy Lopez opening. However, instead, bishop g5 on the board, pinning the knight on f6 to the queen on the d8 square. However, now Arjun, he just drives it back with the move h6. And now, where is the bishop going to go? You can take on f6, or you can go back to the h4 square. Taking is not the best idea. Arjun would have two very strong bishops on a soon-to-be open board. You don't want to allow that. So with that in mind, bishop h4 is the move. But now Arjun, he goes g5 in the spirit of the Rogozin variation of the Queen's Gambit decline, driving that bishop back, and then he just jumps in with the knight. Knight to e4, opting not to trade on g3 right away. Believe it or not, after bishop takes, then f takes, that pawn structure on the king side isn't that bad for white. He will have the open f-file and the open e-file, where he can apply a lot of pressure. So, Arjun, he knows that. He doesn't take on g3 with the bishop, instead offering to take with the knight instead. So a very strong move by Arjun. Now here, Magnus, he does take on d6. Bishop takes, then c takes, not allowing knight takes g3. That would be to Arjun's benefit. Now here, knight d2 for Magnus, putting pressure on that knight on e4. Where is the knight going to go? Well, there's not really a real threat on that knight yet. If you take it, then bishop takes or d takes e4 is perfectly fine for Arjun. So with that in mind here, rook to b8, just putting the rook on the open file, applying pressure on b2. Now here, Magnus, he has to defend. In the game, he does go b3. However, this move right here does have a very serious drawback, and Arjun finds it in an instant. In this position, believe it or not, he jumps in with the knight to the c3 square, and Arjun, he has practically trapped that queen on the d1 square. This is quite comical. So, d1, you can't go there, you can't stay there rather. e2, that's covered by the knight, and b1 also covered by the knight. The only square the queen can't go to is c1. So, queen c1 on the board, only one square available, but fortunately for Magnus, that was a good square for the queen. So queen c1, then Arjun, queen to f6, putting pressure on d4, and now Magnus. How should he proceed? Well, queen b2 is one idea, trying to drive back that knight off c3. Instead, knight to f1, the idea being either knight to e3 or knight to g3. Again, the standard rerouting process for that knight in the Italian opening and the Roy Lopez, but it's also working out quite well here. Now here, black, rook f to e8, Arjun challenging that rook on the e1 square. Now rook takes e1 may be a real threat in certain lines. All right, with that in mind, Magnus, queen d2 on the board, getting off that back rank. And so far, both sides have done an excellent job of managing their time. I'm quite impressed. 4 minutes left on the clock for Magnus versus the 3 minutes of Arjun. All right, now, knight to e4, jumping back with the knight. The queen is under attack, queen d1 on the board. And here Arjun, he has a wide variety of ideas that he could play in this position here. And the most dangerous ones, of course, will involve pushing those pawns down the board on the king side. So g5 and h5 are actually both quite playable here. The computer likes g4 and h5. The computer likes g4 the most. However, instead in the game, h5 was the move by Arjun in the game. Now here, h5 on the board, threatening g4. Then if h takes, you can recapture with the h-pawn. H takes, then go perhaps king g7, rook h8, and so on with a very deadly attack down the h-file. Now Magnus, knight to g3, trying to defend, but Arjun just takes on g3. Knight takes, then f takes, and now Arjun has a very simple tactic to apply a lot more pressure in this position. In the game, he mixes up the order a little bit. In the game, he does go g4 before rook takes e1, and this turns out to be a slightly inaccurate move. Here, g4 on the board, and the drawback of not going rook takes e1 right away is here Magnus does have the option of going rook takes e8 himself. That would be the right move. Instead here, Magnus, he does take back on g4, h takes g4, allowing Arjun once again to fly in with the rook, and this time he does find it. Rook takes, queen takes, then h takes g4 on the board, driving back the knight on f3. And now, where is the knight supposed to go? I mean, you can go to h4, but your knight is going to be trapped there for a very long time. And on d2, that knight will be incredibly passive. So with that in mind here, in the game, Magnus, he does go knight to h4. And this knight is temporarily active. It is temporarily putting pressure on that bishop on f5. However, again, it does risk being locked out of the game, as obviously f3 is not a good square to go to in the future. g6 being covered by the pawn. And beyond that, f5 is the only square, and Arjun should be able to cover it. So, knight h4 on the board, then queen takes d4 on the board for Arjun, winning the free pawn on d4 with check. And now, as you can see by the eval bar on the left, Arjun having quite a solid advantage here. All right, the king has to move. King h2 on the board, then bishop to e4, getting the bishop out of the attack, and also pressuring that pawn on g2 in the future if I can draw arrows correctly. All right, so on g2 in the future. Now here, Magnus, c3 on the board, pressuring the queen. The queen has to move. Queen to e5 in the game. Now queen to e3 for Magnus, setting up perhaps rook to e1 ideas, trying to stabilize the game in the center of the board. Now, king g7, getting the king off the back rank, a solid idea for Arjun. Rook to f1, activating the rook on the semi-open f-file, and now rook to h8, applying quite a bit of pressure on that knight. And now, of course, that pawn on g3 is pinned to the king by the queen on e5. Therefore, rook takes h4 here is actually a threat. And if Magnus doesn't spot this immediately, he will lose the game after rook takes h4. Again, the pawn being pinned by the queen to the king on h2. All right, here, rook to f4 is the move, blocking the queen's access to the king on h2 via the x-ray attack. Now f5 for Arjun. Arjun literally has the entire center of the board on complete and total lockdown. That bishop on e4, supporting these pawns on d5 and f5. And Magnus here, he's in quite a bit of trouble in this game. All right, Magnus, queen takes a7 on the board, winning that free pawn on a7. And now, very importantly, he does have that passed pawn on a2. That could be a very big asset later in the game. All right, king to f6 on the board for Arjun, getting out of check. Queen to f2, and real fast, because everyone is commenting about this in the comment section, I am a real person, I'm not an AI. Shocking. All right, back to the game. King to e6 for Arjun Erigaisi. Now, queen d2 for Magnus. Sorry for that interruption there, had to get out of my system. And now c5 for Arjun, gaining space on the queen side. Now king g1 retreats the king. d4, Arjun gaining space in the center, and he is pushing his central pawn majority down the board. He is threatening to get a pass pawn. For example, d takes c3 would make that d6 pawn a pass pawn, and it could go, say, d5, d4, d3, and so on. All right, now Magnus, c4, officially making that pawn on d4 a protected pass pawn. That will be a huge asset for him later in the game. Of course, Magnus also has that pawn on a2. That could be quite important later as well. Now here, Arjun, d3, pushing the pawn one step closer to promoting on d1. That will be quite a big deal, but here, Magnus Carlsen, he spots the queen and the rook here are vulnerable to the knight fork, and he just jumps in with the knight now that he played king g1, getting his king off the pin by the rook to the knight. So, knight to g6 hits both the queen on e5 and the rook on the hj square. What is Arjun's idea? Well, in the game, he does go queen d4, stepping out of the attack by the knight with tempo on the king on g1. So, queen d4 check, the rook blocks the check, rook to f2, then rook to e8, moving the rook over and out of the attack of the knight on g6. Now, queen to h6 flies in with the queen, and now there are just all sorts of weird discovered attacks. For example, knight to f5 with check on the king could be coming. So for that reason, king d7, Arjun immediately gets out of those ideas. Now, Magnus, queen to h7, once again chasing the king. Once again, it does retreat. Now, queen to h4, king c8, queen g5. Magnus may be threatening rook takes f5 in the future. Of course, right now that rook is pinned by the queen to the king, so not an option yet. All right, king to b8 on the board, then queen to f4, rook to e6, knight h4, queen to a1, king h2, and queen to e5. So far, both sides basically sharking around. Both sides in time pressure here. Arjun Erigaisi, if you can believe it, he is down to literally 2 seconds on the clock here versus the 35 seconds of Magnus. So Arjun, he's playing every single move like as fast as you can possibly blitz it out in this online game. All right, queen to g5, then king b7 for Arjun, a3, king c6, and then b4. And this is where Arjun starts to falter again, down to 1 second on the clock. Very hard to blame him for this. Here, he takes on b4. C takes b4, a slightly dubious move. Instead, he had to wait, say, rook e7, rook e8, and so on. A takes b4, and then again, another dubious idea, d5, again in time pressure. And here, Arjun, he basically threw away most of his advantage with these last two moves. Now, Magnus, C takes d5, wins that pawn on d5. Queen takes d5, wins the pawn back. Then knight takes f5, and that knight is sufficiently defended. Therefore, Magnus does win that pawn on f5. Magnus now has the 3 pawns versus the 2 of Arjun, but of course those pawns on g3 and g2 don't make a very good impression. They're not quite useful yet. Now here, king to b6 on the board, queen e3 is the king, king b7, and here Magnus is starting to run out of time as well. He's down to 15 seconds, meaning Arjun is starting to come back on the clock. Now knight d4 hits the rook to e7 out of the attack, and rook to f4, putting pressure on that bishop on e4. Now here, rook to e8 for Arjun Erigaisi. This turns out to be a missed opportunity. Instead, he had the option of going rook to h7 check, forcing back the king, then bishop takes g2, threatening rook h1 check on the king. That would be quite dangerous. Instead, rook e8 on the board, and now rook takes g4 for Magnus. Now, bishop g6, getting back with the bishop, queen to f3, bishop e4, hitting the queen once again, queen to e3, and once again, bishop g6. So Arjun Erigaisi offering a draw by 3-fold repetition. If Magnus wants it, the draw is queen f3, e3, f3, e3, and the bishop also goes back and forth, back and forth. However, instead in the game, Magnus, queen to f3, bishop e4, then queen f2, getting out of that 3-fold draw. Now here Arjun, queen to h5, hits the king on h2, the rook on g4 blocks it, rook to h4, then queen d5, jumping back with the queen, increasing the pressure yet again on that pawn on g2. All right, rook to f4, rook h8, rook h4, and here Arjun, he does trade the rooks. Keep in mind, both sides have literally 1 to 2 seconds left on the clock. All right, rook takes, g takes, and then Arjun, he plays the move queen d5, hitting the king. King g1, bishop d5, knight to f3, queen a1, hitting the king, king to h2, and then queen to c3, putting pressure on that pawn on c3. Again, both sides 2 to 3 seconds left. All right, queen d2 for Magnus, the queen being supported by the knight. Therefore, queen takes d2 is an option. Arjun doesn't go for it yet. Instead, queen c4, putting pressure on that pawn on the h4 square. Now here, Magnus, knight to e1, jumping back with the knight, putting pressure on d3. However, that does allow queen takes h4 with check. Arjun plays it so. Queen takes king g1, then queen d4 check, king f1, and bishop c4 does defend the pawn for now. All right, here, Magnus, knight to f3, try to drive back that queen. Magnus now down to 1 second versus the 2 seconds of Arjun. Arjun has managed to come back on the clock. He now has twice as much time left. All right, queen to e4, defends the queen. King to f2, And here Arjun, he plays a very tricky move in time pressure, king to b6. And I have to assume this move threw Magnus Carlsen off. He wasn't expecting this. And here, Magnus, he runs out of time on the clock. Arjun has 2 seconds left. Magnus literally out of time. And for that reason, as you can see, he loses the game due to having no time left. Wow, what a crazy back and forth game between the new number 2 rated player in the world, Arjun Ergaisi, and of course the GOAT Magnus Carlsen. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash that like button for me and comment down below what you liked, didn't like about this video. I'm working on my titles quite a bit. I'm trying to make better titles for you guys. Also, my audio, I will have audio improvements likely for the video after this one. I'm getting a lot of bad feedback on my audio, so I will be improving that, and I'm also doing my titles. So again, if you like these new titles, I'm trying to be a little more creative, a little less shocked, let me know. And while you're at it, check out this video right here, where Magnus Carlsen has the audacity to play a Bomb Cloud style opening against Arjun, but Arjun, he steps it up and wins anyway. That game was a lot of fun, so check it out, and I'll see you in the next video.